Trash here on Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman as we spend the rest of the hour going deep inside the processed food industrial complex, beginning with the extraordinary science of addictive junk food. That was the cover story in the recent New York Times Magazine that examined how food companies have known for decades that salt, sugar, and fat are not good for us in the quantities Americans consume them. And yet every year they convince most of us to ingest about twice the recommended amount of salt, 70 pounds of sugar, 22 teaspoons a day. Then there's the fat. Well, New York Times reporter Michael Moss explains how one of the most prevalent fat delivery methods is cheese.
Every year, the average American eats as much as 33 pounds of cheese. That's up to 60,000 calories and 3,100 grams of saturated fat. So why do we eat so much cheese? Mainly it's because the government is in cahoots with the processed food industry. And instead of responding in earnest to the health crisis, they've spent the past 30 years getting people to eat more. This is the story of how we ended up doing just that.
That was Pulitzer Prize-winning New York Times investigative reporter Michael Moss. His new book is called Salt, Sugar, Fat: How the Food Giants Hooked Us. He goes deep inside the laboratories where food scientists calculate the bliss point of sugary drinks or the mouthfeel of fat and use advanced technology to make it irresistible and addictive. As a result of this $1 trillion a year industry, 1 in 3 adults and 1 in 5 kids is now clinically obese. In a bit, we'll look ever further into the process of making processed foods with Melanie Warner, author of Pandora's LunchBox. But first, Michael Moss joins us here in the studio. Welcome to Democracy Now!, Michael.
Thanks for having me.
You open your book with a remarkable summit. Talk about who was there.
This is a meeting in 1999 that engaged the CEOs of some of the largest food companies in the country. And they were presented with a vivid picture of the emerging obesity crisis. And what really amazed me about this meeting when I found out about it and found the records to it and talked to some of the people who were present is that it was none other than one of their own, a senior executive at Kraft, who basically laid the emerging obesity crisis at the feet of the processed food industry and pleaded with them to do something collectively to turn the corner.
What happened?
And coming from him, it was just so powerful. They reacted, as you can imagine, rather defensively. They said, look, we're already providing people with choices in the grocery store. We are committed to nutrition as we are to convenience and low prices. Frankly, they were worried about the lost millions in sales if healthier products they created weren't as attractive as the ones they do make.
Talk about the CEO who basically ended the meeting.
The head of General Mills made all of these points and was especially, I think, aghast at being blamed for the obesity crisis. Because, again, he felt that in the cereal aisle, for example, General Mills was providing Cheerios with low amounts of sugar, and he didn't see a need to down-formulate, if you will, all of the products in the grocery store in order to deal with this obesity crisis, which you have to remember back in '99 was not as grave as it is today.
And of course, the obesity crisis, I mean, in their terms, is about lawsuits, class action lawsuits. What does obesity mean? Why is this such a critical issue?
Well, yes and no. The Kraft official who raised this back in 1999 was actually very deeply and sincerely concerned about the health effects on people and not so worried about litigation. What this did, though, mean to the companies, though, was what I write about in the book, which I have to tell you, Amy, was a bit of a detective story. I managed to come across a trove of internal documents that enabled me to get insiders to talk. And when they did, what it showed was that salt, sugar, fat are the 3 pillars, the holy grail, if you will, on which the food industry survives. And through their research, they know that when they hit the perfect amounts of each of those ingredients, they'll send us over the moon. Products will fly off the shelves. We'll eat more. We'll buy more. And being companies, of course, that they will make more money.
Name names and talk about examples of the weaponizing of salt, sugar, and fat.
One of the legendary senior scientists for the food industry, Howard Moskowitz, walked me through his creation recently of a new soda for Dr. Pepper, a new flavor line. And it was amazing how much effort went into that. You know, a regression analysis, high mathematics. He would take dozens and dozens of formulas just slightly altered to find what he calls the bliss point for sweetness in the sugar. And you can do this own experiment at home. Take a cup of coffee, keep adding sugar until you reach the point that you like it the most. And then when you add more sugar, you actually like it less. Well, the food industry knows that. And they spend huge amounts of effort finding the perfect spot, not just for sugar, but for fat and salt as well.
Frito-Lay head scientist Robert Isan Lee talks about people getting addicted to salt.
Yes. He was a wonderful, brilliant scientist who went to work for Frito-Lay in the late 70s when salt became an issue in Washington and the FDA started holding hearings looking at whether potentially it should regulate salt and not consider it inherently safe. Dr. Lin began pushing Frito-Lay to cut back on salt in its own products for economic reasons. He thought it would position the company really well. And he left Frito-Lay, and years later when I met him and we went through the documents that he saved from his days at Frito-Lay, it was just amazing to sit down with him at his dining room table and listen to his regrets at not having been able to have done more way back in the 70s and early 80s.
Talk about the tobacco industry's effect on the food industry.
I love this part of the story because it's really surprising. Philip Morris became the largest food manufacturer in the United States starting in the late 80s when it acquired General Foods and then Kraft. And as you can imagine, for the first decade of that ownership, it pushed the food managers to do everything they could to sell their products. But starting in the late 90s, when Philip Morris came under increasing pressure for nicotine and tobacco, and it was the first tobacco company to acknowledge, or rather to accept, the idea of government regulation, the Philip Morris officials turned to their food people and said, you guys, and this is private of course, you guys are going to face the same issue we're facing over nicotine with salt, sugar, fat, and obesity. And they began nudging their food managers to start thinking about ways to ease back on their dependence on those three ingredients.
The problem with obesity, what it means for example, children.
You know, in my own household, I have two boys, 8 and 13, and you can just see the sugar craving that kids have inevitably for sugar. You know, we've tried to work with our grocery shopping to get control and I think that's one of the key things.
How do you do it with your kids?
Well, so with the kids, my wife Eve kind of arbitrarily said, hey guys, let's try to limit your cereal when we eat cereal in the morning to 5 grams or less of sugar. And we found that when you engage them in that, shopping becomes an Easter egg hunt, and they're able to go to the cereal aisle and find those cereals that meet that quota. And they may have to reach low, or I may have to reach high to find them, because the most sugary ones tend to be at eye level by calculation. But I think it's a really important issue, which you just can't throw fresh carrots and fresh apples at kids without engaging them. They'll chuck them out in the lunchroom. But if we could invigorate the home economics program in this country, which fell by the wayside, I think that would be a huge. Well, home economics. Kids in school used to be taught how to shop, how to cook from scratch, how to be in control of their diets. Doesn't happen anymore, and I write about this in the book. What did happen is we got Betty Crocker, a figment of the imagination of a marketing official at a food company. She began pushing processed foods, convenience foods, as an alternative to scratch cooking.
Explain more.
This was back in the 50s and 60s. Betty Crocker, as you all know, I used to think she was a real person. She wasn't. She started out just as a marketing tool for the companies, but she became emblematic of the food industry's assertion, if you will, of the home economists. And their notion was, hey, look, who's got time for scratch meals anymore? Let's encourage consumers to buy our convenience foods to make things easier for them.
Talk about Lunchables, how they were invented, what they mean.
I got to interview and see documents that were kept by Bob Drain, who worked for Oscar Mayer back in the 80s when the company faced a problem with its meat. People were cutting back on consumption of red meat because it has saturated fat and salt. And Mr. Drain and his team set about looking for a way to repackage those products. He was most interested in saving jobs, and he cared very much about the company. And they came up with the Lunchables, which, as you know, is basically a cold TV dinner aimed at kids for school lunches. But it has two remarkable things beyond kind of the ingredients that they used: meat, cheese, crackers, typically. First, they went after working moms who work outside of the home and designed it and marketed it as a way for moms to get through the crush of the 7 a.m. crush in the household where everybody's scrambling to get out of the house and off to school and work. But then they went after the kids with an amazing marketing campaign, because they realized that the Lunchables wasn't about food. It was about empowerment for kids. And they came up with the slogan, "All day you got to do what they say, but lunchtime is all yours." And kids went nuts for it. Pizza Lunchables, think about it. It's a piece of cold dough, cheese, tomato sauce that the kids assemble themselves, but that meant everything to kids, and sales skyrocketed.
And then they added dessert.
And then they added dessert, hamburger Lunchables, hot dog Lunchables, pancake Lunchables, some of them with huge loads of salt, sugar, fat. Kraft, to its credit, is now pulling back on those ingredients, and you can actually find some much lower amounts. But it opened the door to something really important, which is the fast food industry has moved into the grocery store. So you no longer have to go to a fast food chain to find problematic foods.
Michael Moss, talk about cheese. Talk more about cheese.
So I was amazed to hear that figure, that we are now, on average, eating as much as 33 pounds of cheese a year. And I thought, how could that be? And that's triple the amount back in the 70s. And the story goes like this. Starting in the 60s, people began drinking less whole milk as a way of reducing calories and intake of saturated fat. That left the dairy industry with a glut of whole milk and the milk fat they were extracting from the whole milk to make skim milk. They went to the government and asked for help, and they started making more cheese with that milk. The government, since it subsidizes the dairy industry, bought the cheese. It accumulated. It was storing the cheese in caves in Missouri when none other than Ronald Reagan came into office and says, "This is crazy. We've got $4 billion worth of cheese that's going moldy. Stop it." But they still wanted to support the industry, so they came up with a marketing scheme that allowed the dairy industry to collect tens of millions of dollars every year to encourage consumers, for advertising and marketing, to encourage consumers to eat more cheese. Not just as a delicacy that you eat as an hors d'oeuvre before dinner, but as an ingredient in processed food. And so suddenly cheese began showing up as slices on sandwiches, as ingredients in packaged foods in the store. And our consumption of saturated fat, while we thought we were taking it out of our diets, snuck back in, because cheese is largely invisible as a fat in that form.
Michael Moss, Jeffrey Dunn, whistleblower, or at least quit Coke. He was in charge of, what, $44 billion of sale of Coke.
Wasn't quite that much. He was in charge of North America, Latin America. I'm glad you raised that, because
rather 20 billion.
Jeffrey Dunn was the top warrior at Coke, and he was the heir apparent, one of the heir apparents to the entire company. In 2000, when he began having a change of heart, and by the way, he walked me through all the incredible marketing strategy that Coke has, including targeting the most vulnerable consumers, which the company calls heavy users.
Don't call them consumers anymore. They're heavy users.
Heavy users. 20% of their customers drink 80% of the Coke, and those are the people that it's gone after. But starting in 2000, Jeffrey Dunn had a change of heart. It started with reading a book about sugar and the health effects. It went to his fiancée, who started like nudging him. "Hey, Jeffrey, do you really want to be doing this with your life?" And then he went to Brazil, where Coke was starting to market soda to the emerging middle class there. And out of the blue, Jeffrey says it was almost a voice he heard said to him, Jeffrey, you know, these kids need a lot of things, but one thing they don't need is another Coke. He went back to the company, pushed them to work more on selling healthier drinks, including soda, and cut back on marketing to schools. He ultimately left the company, and today he is selling fresh carrots from a farm in California, but with this, and this is really important because this may be one way out of the situation that we're in. He's marketing carrots as junk food, meaning he's stolen a page of the playbook from the junk food industry to make carrots attractive to kids. And I think that is so brilliant.
We should probably clarify that he was pushing, when we say Coke, though it sounds like when you're talking about heavy users, cocaine, we're talking Coca-Cola.
Absolutely. So.
And the problem with Coca-Cola and what it means and why, for example, when they pushed it to Mexico at the time of a terrible recession, they upped their advertising because they thought, well, if anyone's got any money, they could put it into Coke.
And Coke will say, look, we're only part of the, in fact, recently they had an ad campaign saying, hey, we're only part of the obesity crisis. You can't blame everything on us as calories as calories. But there is something interesting with liquids. Science is starting to show that our brains are less able to detect calories in liquids. So people in the know, including food industry executives, when they run into health trouble, the first thing they do is cut calories out of all the liquids that they drink as a way of maintaining their weight.
What were you most shocked by?
Well, it was one was that, how on a personal level, how so many executives I met don't eat their own foods. The other thing I think that really shocked me was when I get to salt in the book, which is how dependent and how hooked the food companies are on salt, because it's a miracle ingredient for them. It lets them avoid using more costly ingredients like spices and herbs. It, of course, has this thing they call flavor burst, which just gets you so excited about eating snack foods especially. But the other thing is salt masks off notes or bad flavors that are inherent to some processed foods. In meat, it's called warmed over flavor, which happens when the fat in meat oxidizes when it reheats, and salt is one of those things that can cover up that taste. So I was really struck, and Kellogg invited me into the research and development department, made for me special versions of their icons, like Cheez-Its, which I could normally eat all day long, without any salt. It was the most god-awful experience you can imagine tasting those items. They are stuck between a rock and a hard place.
Michael Moss, I want to thank you for being with us. His book is called Salt, Sugar, Fat: How the Food Giants Hooked Us. His cover story in last Sunday's New York Times Magazine, The Extraordinary Science of Addictive Junk Food. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. Michael Moss is a Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter. He won in 2010 for his investigation into the dangers of contaminated meat. But we're not leaving food. When we come back, we'll be joined by another New York Times reporter, Melanie Warner, who wrote Pandora's LunchBox. You don't want to miss it, or maybe you do. It depends on what you're eating these days. Stay with us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
In a bunker in Kings County, trouble on my mind. They're coming for the others. When they're done, they'll come for mine. Feel the chill in the air, feel the tingle in the spine. They'll make everyone a suspect and make the trains run on time. So buckle down now, baby. You got nowhere to run. Yeah. This is main season, baby. It's only just begun. Yeah. So tighten up your belt, lace up your shoes. Times are getting worse, and you know you're bound to lose. They know just how to slice it.
Theme from Mean Season by Wrench. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report, and a special shout-out to Essex County Community College. The students are here today watching at Democracy Now!, democracynow.org. I'm Amy Goodman as we continue deep inside the $1 trillion a year processed food industrial complex. We turn to look at how decades of food science have resulted in the cheapest, most abundant, most addictive, and most nutritionally inferior food in the world. and the vitamins and protein added back to this processed food, well, you might be surprised to know where they come from. That's the focus of a new book by longtime food reporter Melanie Warner, author of Pandora's LunchBox, How Processed Food Took Over the American Meal. Melanie, welcome to Democracy Now! She's joining us from Denver, Colorado. Vitamins, vitamin-added food. You think you go to the grocery store and you want to get a little added punch, and you want to ensure that your kids, that your family has added vitamins. What's the problem with that?
Yeah, well, hi, Amy. It's great to be here. You know, one of the things with processed food that I found while doing this book is not only that it has an abundance of the things that Michael was talking about, salt, sugar, fat, it's also what it's lacking, which it turns out is naturally occurring nutrition in many cases. So that's vitamins and minerals and fiber and things like antioxidants. So you take something like cereal, you know, you walk down the cereal aisle and you're bombarded with health messages. It's high in vitamin D, good source of calcium, fiber, antioxidants. You see these things all over the package. And one of the questions I asked myself when I was starting to work on this book was, why is it nearly impossible to find a box of cereal in the cereal aisle without vitamins, added vitamins and minerals in the ingredient list? And it turns out because most cereal has very little inherent nutrition. And this is in part because of processing. The processing of food is very intensive. It's very technical, and with cereal, it can be very damaging to naturally occurring nutrients, especially vitamins and oftentimes fiber. So what manufacturers do is they add back in vitamins. So essentially, you see all these wonderful claims on the package, but essentially, and you look at the panel and you're getting 35% and 40% of your recommended daily allowance of these vitamins, but they're essentially added in like a vitamin pill, which many people may be already taking in the morning. And I was really surprised to learn where some of these vitamins come from. I never really thought about it in much detail, as probably most people don't, but it turns out that these vitamins are not coming from the foods that contain them. Like vitamin C does not come from an orange, and vitamin A does not come from a carrot. It's very far from that. They come from things that really aren't actually foods. Vitamin D, for instance, was probably the most shocking. It comes from sheep grease. So actually the grease that comes from sheep wool. You have giant barges and container ships that go from Australia and New Zealand over to China, where a lot of our vitamins are produced. About 50% of global vitamin production comes from China inside these huge factories, very industrial processes. A lot of vitamins are actually chemical processes, and they're very technical and complex.
A lot of people, if they're with someone, they're looking at them right now. Wait a second. So China gets all these shipments of sheep wool from Australia, and they're pulling the sheep grease off of them to make vitamin D?
Yeah, sheep grease is actually very useful for a lot of things. It can be used to make moisturizer and lip balm. It can be used for industrial purposes, for lubricants, for engines and machines and things like that. But one of its uses is to be converted through a number of chemical steps and chemical processes to vitamin D, which is added to our food and used in supplements. So
what about nylon, Melanie? What does nylon have to do with vitamins?
Yeah, it's one of these chemicals that goes into the making of one of the B vitamins. There are many food additives actually that are used in food, but actually also have industrial purposes associated with them. One of my favorites is a food additive called azotiocarbidamide, and that's actually used quite extensively in bread and bread type products. And it's used as a dough conditioner and a manufacturing aid. And its main use outside of the manufacturing of bread is for creating foamed plastic, so things like yoga mats. And I encountered some news articles from a number of years ago where a tanker truck overturned on the Dan Ryan Expressway in Chicago carrying azotiocarbidamide. And city fire officials had to issue their highest hazmat alert and evacuate everyone up to a half-mile downwind because of this chemical spill. So you look at something like that and you wonder, is this something that we really want in our morning toast and the bread that goes on our turkey sandwiches?
Well, that's a very important question. Now, of course, the processed food industry, the gross sales are enormous, but you may have redefined gross sales. Let's talk about some of the experiments the scientist Melanie Warner conducted. Talk a little about chicken tenders.
Yeah, I'm not much of a scientist, but a number of years ago, when I started covering the food industry, I became curious about expiration dates that are printed on packages. Pretty much you go into the supermarket and every package in the store will have an expiration date on it. And I wondered, well, what will happen? What do these expiration dates mean, and what will happen after this date has come and gone? Some of these dates are actually quite far out. They'll be 6 to 9 months or even more. So I started collecting a number of food products, and I saved them in my office. And then I would open them after the expiration dates had passed, sometimes long after the expiration dates had passed because I had forgotten about them. And what I found out over time, I collected all kinds of products, cereal, cookies, Pop-Tarts, fast food meals, frozen dinners, I mean, you name it. I have all kinds of gross stuff in my office at this point. And what I found, there were a few exceptions, but what I found was that most of this food did not decompose or mold or go bad, even after long, long periods of time. I mean, I started this 7, 8 years ago, and I still have slices of cheese that are perfectly orange.
From years and years and years ago.
Years and years and years ago.
And what keeps their color, and what keeps them looking completely preserved?
There are a variety of reasons for this depending on the product. Sometimes it's because of powerful chemical preservatives that are in it. Sometimes it's because of additives that lower the acidity of products so that no microorganisms can grow. And sometimes it's because food manufacturers are very intentionally remove all the water from products. That's the case with
Melanie,
cereal
right now,
and cookies.
For our TV viewers, we're showing images of guacamole bought in a store, presumably, you know, maybe even a Whole Foods type store, you know, a natural food store, and your own guacamole, and the difference how long it's preserved.
Yeah, I think this was an unusual tub of guacamole, and it had an unusual dose of food additives. My husband came back from the store with it one day and said, oh, they made an announcement. They made it fresh over at the deli. So I thought, oh, this is great. And I looked at the ingredients, and there were some ingredients on there that I never even heard of. And I was spending a lot of time doing research on food additives. So I put it away. I stored it in the fridge, and I thought, well, I'll look into this later and see what these additives are. And then an interesting thing happened about 9 months later. I completely forgot about it in the back of the fridge. My mom, who lives with us, she announced that she had tried some of the guacamole. And I thought she was referring to a recent purchase that I had made at a different store that we had bought for a party. But I thought, you know, I think a lot of that's gone. And it turns out that she had tried the old guacamole, the 9-month-old stuff. And I was horrified because she's an older person. She's in her early 80s, and foodborne illness in older people is no small thing. So I was terrified that she was going to be horribly ill. In fact,
because the guacamole was how old?
9 months. It was 9 months old. Yeah. So, and she had eaten it because it had no mold on it. It didn't smell bad. It was a little bit, when I looked at it, it was a little bit discolored around the edges, you know. So some people might have thought, oh, maybe I'm not going to eat it. But she looked at it and thought, oh, this is a nice guacamole. So, and in the end, thankfully, she'd only had a little bit, and she was totally fine. She had no effects whatsoever.
Melanie, 15 seconds before we end part one of this discussion, what most surprised you?
I think just the overall extent to which the technology and food science has merged with food production, and the level of engineering that goes in, the level of technology and the level of processing that goes into our food, and also the extent to which the FDA is not watching over what goes into our food in terms of food additives very closely.
We're going to talk soy products in part two. Melanie Warner, longtime journalist covering the food industry. Her new book is called Pandora's Lunchbox: How Processed Food Took Over the American Meal.